I'm Peter Campbell, and I suppose the aim is to tell you a little bit about the background of the property and the Campbell family in this area. The family are very proud that they can trace their history back, and they go right back to Colin Campbell and go back to the 1300s. There's a chart that someone's gone to a lot of trouble to prepare. Of course today you wouldn't know how true that is or not, but the whole thing does run back through Scotland, come back to Australia in the late 1800s when the family actually came into South Australia as a line of priests. And it seemed to be that everywhere you look back in the history there must have been one or two of the generations ended up as priests. These priests through the Anglican Church seem to sort of have a fair amount of money, because I'll come back to that in a moment, but it really sort of showed that as they were dying off, my grandfather, who established here, ended up getting some very nice payments where there were trusts that were there, and also upon the death there were some big amounts of money that came through, which I think sustained this property. So in the he was actually an industrial chemist and did work in Fiji, primarily up in North Queensland as a sugarcane chemist. Somehow managed to buy this property and buy it on terms, and the terms for 5 years. I understand the deposit was minimal. There is a contract floating around the place still, and he had trouble making the first quarterly payment. So he was a gentleman farmer and tried a lot of things here. Everything that he tried just wasn't going to work, because from what I can pick up, he wasn't the type to actually put his shoulder in behind anything. And frankly, they started right on the other side of the dam, and what was now known as a corn paddock. That didn't work, maize didn't work, cattle didn't work, and finally he hit the jackpot with chickens. Now it became a poultry farm, and because of his interest in genetic engineering at the time, managed to do some crossbreeding. And the whole way through the family there were always sheds on the farm that were crossbreeding, double whites and white blacks and leghorns and australorps, all the rest of it. And so he actually managed to strike a strain that was created that was good for laying, good as a meat chicken, and lasted 2 or 3 years. So from that, this particular house that we're in was built on the property in 1910. So by 1914 he became the largest poultry farmer in Queensland, and that was really from his genetic engineering, and that sort of allowed him to make those payments that he couldn't make beforehand. And it was actually underneath the house, which has now got a flat, was where the old brooder houses and everything are, so there's no old photographs around. The house itself came as a demountable. If you imagine 1910, I imagine there wasn't very much out here, and it wasn't a case where you came and sort of built your house. You actually went there and bought a frame from I think it was Campbell's down at Albion, not at Albion, at Eagle Farm, and that was delivered back out here. And of course the deck has been expanded later, and everything has been lifted up and changed, so whether or not it's got any historical value as such, I don't know, but it's one of the oldest houses in the area, 1910. Our next door neighbour was 1864, and that was Mackenzie's or Day's Cottage, the old Hawkins Garden Centre. And that's more of its original stage. But this here started with the brooder houses back underneath, that the farm was on 250 acres, but only about 40 acres of that was used for farming purposes. They were pretty resilient, I think, the way they set these things up, because there was a lot of pipes and pumps and things that were done, well, they wouldn't pass engineering standards, but they worked. And if you look from where we are, we're looking over an old dam which is now council parkland. Is absolutely shameful to what it used to be, and that of course was the water supply, and that water supply was important to be able to pump up to Keong Road opposite Cuthbert's. There was a high level water tank there. Gravity fed back down behind the hatchery, and from the hatchery it then sort of fed back out into all the colonies, and all the pens. There were 10 rows of pens, and they were all on the ground. So there's actually 10,000 chooks in there, all for egg, virtually none for meat production. I've got to say, even to this day, I'm not all that excited about chicken in any form. I've never seen anyone like my father who managed to make chicken go so many ways, chicken rissoles and everything. I think the only thing that was worse was Tuesday night, and that was tripe. I only found out recently that my sister never ate tripe. She said very early in the piece she wasn't having it, and somehow I managed to sit there and eat this stuff, and she got out of it. Anyway, going back to the farm, 250 acres. It went from the what is now the Fruit Extremes, that was an Ampol service station, and went right back up to Dawn Street. And the Dawn Road, that's the spa up there, the start of the country club estate. There's only this 40 acres that was primarily used, and Grandpa Campbell employed quite a number of people who would come in on a seasonal basis, because as you know, I mean, Christmas Day, the chooks still lay, every day they lay, and in our summers, if in fact the water system broke down back then and now, it was all hands to the pumps to make certain that everything sort of worked well. Grandpa Campbell's name was Matthew Hale Campbell, and when you go back to this family history, what you'll see is that name Matthew Hale comes up many, many times. And as a real estate agent, I think it's very important that Sir Matthew Hale was I think he's the Lord High Executioner and Chancellor of the Exchequer in his time. But the Torrens law, the very system of real estate that we use here, that is still in Australia, was actually developed by him, Sir Matthew Hale, back whenever that period was. So Matthew Hale Campbell was my grandfather, a crusty old gentleman from what I can pick up. He married Jessie Julian, and the streets here are named after them, which is Jullyan. Everyone pronounced it incorrectly. The family always sort of said, well, where did she come from? Because apparently it was over in Fiji, and she's a lass from Dunedin. But it was actually the Julian family ended up from Victoria. They married, came out here, had the children, and there was a last 10 years behind the rest of them. Was my father, born in 1921. That was also Matthew Hale Campbell. And of course, he, when he was born, was I don't think really welcome from what I can pick up. So from a sense of a strong home environment, it wasn't there. He went out to Slade School at Warwick. As soon as he got out of Slade School at Warwick, he sort of ended up in the army. Very handy having the same name as your father, because the documents that I see now where he signed on as a 16-year-old has got his brother's signature on it, Frederick Alexander, and has also got his supposedly his father's signature on the papers. But of course we can see now it's the same signature. Fred, of course, wasn't allowed to go to the war because he was here for the home industry to keep these things going. And Dad went overseas, didn't go overseas, he's actually went to Western Australia and was ready for Singapore. They were actually demobbed and ready to go, and Singapore fell. So they brought them back around. He was in the Armoured Division, so brought them back to Townsville, again all set up to go. And suddenly they realised that the tanks they were using wouldn't work up in Papua New Guinea, because they'd be too heavy and they wouldn't work. So he never went overseas, which he indicates was sort of one of his one of the things that he disappointed in. The farm itself, it blossomed because the two brothers took over. Grandpa Campbell ended up going back to Toowoomba, Jellicoe Street. Spent his later years up there. At the age of 82, he had his licence taken away by my father because he put his V8 over the range a couple of times, and that was cataracts. When he died at the age of 87, and the two boys, Fred and Matt, were then running the farm. There are many highlights of field days that happened here because it was apparently a very cutting edge on what was happening. There were big hatcheries and just all the buildings. Every building sort of had a name. It was row 1, it was row 2, it was pen whatever. You had the hatchery, you had the brooder house, the powerhouse. We had a big Southern Cross engine in here that powered the total, and could have powered Cuthbert's, our next door neighbours, as well, if they'd put the lines through. So it was an enterprise by itself. Grandpa Campbell was involved in the formation of the Red Comb, also the Queensland Poultryman Association, and that then became Sunny Queen Eggs as it's known now, Audley Marketing. Fred followed through on that, so Fred was very much active outside the farm in a lot of the organisations. He eventually went on to Parliament. Dad was always here in the local district. The farm itself became the home of many organisations, and that goes right back. If you look at armoured reunions, they were here. You look at the churches local, they were here, where we had this beautiful expanse of mown grass, and of course you didn't have that anywhere else. I said earlier there were no cattle, no sheep, and what we had was what was called the green fields, and the green fields were actually about 15 acres of grass that was mown by a cylinder mower. So the cylinder mower, of course, gives you a beautiful surface. That was done a couple of times a week, and the green was to complement the grain, because we had our own silos and everything else. So the eggs themselves were a nice rich egg, and we had a lot of door sales. We had a lot of people who would come along over Sunday to buy the broilers, where they're 2 or 3 year old burnt outs, and they'd all be put in a pen, and people come and buy those. My job was shoveling the manure, and I had my own pens, and I got 3p a bag, and I did very, very well, thank you. And I tell you, when the show came up and all these other things were coming, I wanted money. Did I shovel? And I say in a term, I'm still doing the same thing in real estate many, many years later. But the farm itself did very well, and that continued into a massive fire in the late 50s. The whole thing was gutted. I don't know if you've ever been in a fire, but we were at the dancers, I think it was their 21st birthday, and it was one of the staff who were here at the farm, and we just up the road and got the call, Strathpine 5-4, Strathpine 5-4. Always had someone listening on the other end of the phone. But we got that call, and we came back, which might have been about 9, 10 o'clock at night. The fire tenders were trying to pump water back out of the dam. The whole thing was ablaze, and this is all our day-old chickens. And these, I still remember that you opened the door and it just engulfed in flame, and all these chickens, all with flames on and the whole lot. That was the beginning of the end of the farm itself. Whilst they rebuilt, Fred by that time was doing very, very well in the poultry field. He was a real community man. He could walk into a room and he could meet 20 people and remember their names at the end of the meeting, and go meet them in another environment later on. He did some Dale Carnegie course, I'm told, and meet them somewhere else totally out of place, and would be able to remember their name. Gee, I wish I had that ability. But he continued on and entered Parliament as the state member for Aspley, and then rose to be the deputy leader of the Liberal Party. He served under a couple of under Chalk, and I think also under Knox. And the farm started to wane, because you needed the input of the two. And once they cut back from the numbers of the 10,000 to the 8, I guess it must have become uneconomical. We went down to Sydney. I remember going down and seeing the Ingham brothers, and the Ingham brothers and Multiplo had some deal, and what they'd do is they'd cage your farm. They'd rebuild your total farm, and then they would provide the stock, and you'd churn it through, and they were guaranteed buyer at the end. I remember it was $3 a bird. Now $3 a bird was for the massive shed, it was for all the cages, and also for the bird. So it was a pretty good deal. And Dad spent 2 days down there, and Mum and Di and I went down. But at the end of it, he just turned around and said, "No, I'm not doing this. If this is what you've got to do to survive, I'm not going to do it." Now, he was never really known as a greenie. None of the farmers around here were known as greenies or tree huggers, but in that sense, he made that decision not. And I think when he made that decision not to go into the cages, I think that was the end of it, because 10,000, 8,000 was no longer the run. It was 100,000, 200,000 birds with 2 or 3 birds. So the farm itself failed over a period of time. It just got less and less, and then they started selling off some of the land. One of the first things they did is that when Grandpa Campbell died, what is now known as the Dawn Reserve, that area, that had to be sold off for probate. People today think we don't have probate. Well, we have. We've got it in terms of capital gains tax, and the capital gains tax is going to be much higher than the probate that was ever there. Joe, of course, removed the probate during his period. But at that time, the property was actually owned by Grandpa Campbell alone, not his wife Jessie. That was actually left 37 acres, which is the old house here, and the farm, that was left to the boys, and the 150 acres was left to the girls. Well, there wasn't enough money to go around, so that was sold, and sold to the Queensland Housing Commission. And can you believe that the furore that was created many years later, that was in the 70s and the 80s, when they had this plan to build 600,000-700,000 houses, 600 to 700 houses and units back here alongside us here in Albany Creek. I mean, it just wouldn't be the same area. And I've had an incident today of social housing where a house has just been virtually totally wrecked, and I just can't actually see that could be happening here in Albany Creek. So that was not a good move for the area, but obviously a good move for the family at the time, because it sort of put the dollars back in there. The farm itself closed down. Dad went to work as a printer for Simpson Halligan. Go back to the fact that he had no engineering experience, but kept all the engines and kept everything going in this place. It was absolutely incredible. And then he got a job as a printer doing golden circle labels, and this massive big machine, and apparently it was always breaking down, and when he went in the job he said, "I'll do this, do that, whatever," and he was the man. So he did that for a while, got a job with Sunny Queen Eggs, which is back to where he wanted to be as an inspector. And he travelled all over Queensland in inspecting, counting the chooks. That was a time when there was a big debate going on, and actually new legislation was brought in. There's a lot of eggs were coming over the border from New South Wales. It's hard to believe now that was a big fight at the time. We were talking about state rights and everything else. But Sunny Queen Eggs, he was employed there until he retired, and we then came to that point where in retirement, of course, when you're on a farm, you don't think about superannuation. So they had sold off this 150 acres. He then had also sold off in the 70s 10 or 15 acres at the back, and that became a subdivision which is now known as Malvern Street and Windermere Street and Toorak, that area there. And that area became the start really of my life in real estate. Dad joined us after some time. He had a couple of years off, but he sort of sat here with his man from his superannuation AMP, and the question, I remember it very clearly, the question was, "How long do you expect to live, Mr. Campbell?" And of course the whole family had been doing pretty well. In fact, he died at the age of 87, the same as his father had. And there was just no money. So he came in and became my property manager in the business. I never knew if he was doing property management or he was doing church counselling. I never knew what was going on. I still to this day suspect that he paid out of his own pocket rents for people. And there's always these things that were going on that, they didn't have food or didn't have that, and he was doing these special calls. He was the only property manager I know that actually carried a cleaning kit in his car. And if the tenant hadn't cleaned it properly, he'd get in there and do a couple of hours himself, because he really didn't want them to lose the bond and the friction and all the rest of it. So in many ways he was totally suited for real estate in the sense of a people person. But then I think, as I said, sometimes I didn't know if it was his church was sort of taking over his responsibilities in the business. But he made a lot of friends in this area, and this area, the farm itself, became the centre of the community. The area must have been a very different area in the 1910s and 1930s, and then of course as we go through it started to develop in the 60s. A story that I must tell is that there were only 2 motor vehicles in Albany Creek in the 1927 and 1930, and that was Mr. Morgan and Mr. Campbell. My auntie who lived in this house, I actually never ever lived here. I lived in another house which I'll come back to on the property. But my auntie tells the story, Aunt Ellen, who died a couple of years ago, that the old man would actually drive past her walking from Aspley back to the farm along Albany Creek Road. And these vehicles, they were actually for transportation of produce, they were not for passenger use. You know, if you can think of that in these terms today, of doing that, you know, your daughter-in-law walking down the road. Fred and Ellen, and they ended up living in this particular house. And Fred had numerous parties here, Liberal Party functions. It was the centre of the young Liberal movement, what was known as the Barn. The Barn, I became involved in Young Liberals myself, but the Barn itself was well in existence even when I was a 13, 14-year-old. When you look back on it, it was actually an underage drinking area back out in the suburbs. I mean, imagine Albany Creek back at that time. But when we go back into 1937, supposedly there was some great rift between Grandpa and Grandma Campbell. That great rift eventuated in the fact that he had gone out and bought himself yet another new car, and he wasn't supposed to. So she went down to the, I don't know who it was, the Shire clerk, the Shire chairman. There was only one person of Pine Rivers at that time, and went down there, and she managed to get a subdivision of a 1 acre block of land. And that 1 acre block of land is at 5 Toorak Road, and that's where I actually grew up. She then went to Vollers and got a house designed, and the house, I would think it's like any other Queensland Housing Commission house, frankly. I'd lived in there my total life, but she only lived in that for 6 months, but out of spite. So she must have had some money stashed away somewhere, and had this house built. Well, the house, of course, is all fibro. Every single bit of it was fibro, which was the latest product at that particular time. You know, the terrazzo floor, the Tilux there. Much more modern than this house. This house has got no bathroom. Unbelievable that there is no bathroom. There is a bathroom underneath the house that was near where the separator for the cream used to be, but still no bathroom upstairs. The kitchen itself is a very modest kitchen. Very, very narrow benches, and the whole thing was really economically done, very economically done. So we then go back into the farm itself, and the farm was used on Saturday nights for young Liberals. It was used during the week, and I'm talking through the 50s, 60s, 70s and onwards. It was used for so many organisations, because within Albany Creek there was one community hall, and thank God for the Salvos, because it was the Salvation Army Hall, now the National Bank on Albany Creek Road. And when I look back on it, and I think what they put up with, that their creed, where they're against the drinking and everything else, and this was the only place that you could fundraise. And so if we wanted to raise money for a kindergarten or do anything at all in the area, in those days of the late 60s, 70s, it was the Salvation Army Hall. It had the outside toilets, and then they had to clean up the mess and have their church services the next morning. So I've got great time still for the Salvation Army. As the area started to build, what also built was the need for more areas that you could meet. So the old hatchery, by this time, was in disuse. It wasn't being used as a hatchery. I was using the brooder house, what used to be the brooder house, which was a building of about 7 metres long by about 3 metre wide. And the brooder house used to be from them coming out of the incubator from the day old, and after a week they'd go back into the brooder house, and Dad used to play music to them. They loved, all our chickens loved Gilbert and Sutherland, frankly. They absolutely loved the music. Made them better, made them, when they went on into the cage, into the sheds, they didn't, when you walked in, they didn't sort of fly as much. However, the need came for another venue, and Mahaca, M-A-H-A-C-A, Matthew Hale Campbell. The property itself became the venue for you name it. And you can look at virtually any organisation that was in this area, and it's had your start here. Dad was patron of so many of those things, and bear in mind, get in the context that Fred's out there in Parliament, he's out there in the wider community, had very little contact with Albany Creek proper. He's out there doing the big macro, Dad's doing the micro. And when you looked in here, the guides, the scouts, they used to have their bottle drives here. And the church, I mean, I mentioned the church. Our day on a Sunday started off with a 6 o'clock service down at Aspley, followed by another service, which is a Sunday school at Aspley. I was deputy superintendent there, and we had 360 children there. From there on, we would then come out to church service here in the hatchery, and then we'd have the Sunday school, where I had about 60 or 70 children back in the mid-60s. If you think of that, that was a pretty big Sunday school, and we really didn't worry about who they were, what they were, as long as they came along, and it was a very good time. From there, the community involvement, I think, of Dad built, because he had the facility that everyone else wanted. And when you had anything to do with Dad, you didn't just get the house, you didn't just get the building, you got him as well. And he was there in the working bee, and he was there turning the lights out and doing the whole box and dice. I go back to the young libs, and most embarrassing was it was lights out at 11 o'clock. And if you can imagine sort of the party in full swing at 11, I mean, they did close down in those days about 12, 1 o'clock, not 3, 5 in the morning. But we all knew the rules, and you'd lose track of time in there. If you're having a good time, you might have had a few runs. Bundaberg rum was a big thing in those days. And next minute, Dad and or Fred, or both, would come in their pyjamas. The most embarrassing thing you could ever have, with all your peers and all your mates, and come in, walk inside the hatchery, and pull the fuses out and walk back out again. And that was the end of the party. Now, they were good parties, they're good fundraisers and all the rest of it, but he sort of had that way. So as much as you could do what you wanted to do, there were also those rules. There's also that line that you didn't go over. He felt that the parties were getting a little bit raucous. They were getting Don Cameron, who was a member for Parliament for Griffith. He hopped in his car one night, might have had a few too many. Instead of going in reverse, he actually went right through the side of the red shed. Well, next morning, Dad's on the phone to him, and you will, and Don, very hungover before lunchtime, was to be seen there nailing a new sheet of galvanised iron back in the shed. When you looked at any of the functions, we had progressive dinners, and those progressive dinners, they were magic. You'd have 80, 90 people here. It was all prepared within the hatchery. Everything was brought in. There were no pie warmers, there were no heaters, there was absolutely nothing there. We all bought in. If you had a barbecue, it wasn't the barbecue that you have today, this nice stainless steel thing that you buy from Bunnings for whatever. He'd get out with a rotary hoe and dig the hole. That would be dug a couple of days beforehand. There'd be a whole lot of logs which would come back out of the paddock. They'd be put in there, they'd be fired up about 11 o'clock in the morning. You would have soil back on the top of it. And when you opened it up for your barbecue at 5, 6 o'clock at night, what a magic barbecue it was, with just total coals. In those days it was BYO. You bought your own meat, you bought your own drink. And I go back as a young kid, I can't ever remember alcohol being at any of the parties. In fact, I can't remember alcohol being in our house. And it was very strange for Christmas if someone sort of bought something and there'd be a shandy or a half bottle of beer or something that'd always be left and sit there. But those that style of living was very generous, I think, in the way it was done. Dad and Fred were very generous with what they had, be it the garden parties, whether you wanted to have the scouts camp out in the bush, whatever it may have been. The reunions, Moles had a massive reunion here. I've got some photographs taken from the silo, and 300 odd people turned up. I don't remember the year, but as I